Hello, church family. I hope this recording finds you well. I hope that you are having a lovely day, whether you're watching this shortly after it's been recorded, November of 2020, or sometime down the road. This is certainly an interesting week to be kind of just speaking into a camera as opposed to face with so much going on in our country and around the world. And I hope that you've got a good thing going wherever you are. And I hope that this finds you thoroughly involved in one of our micro churches. And if you have not made it to one of them yet, I hope you find one soon. I've been very excited to be a part of Derek Ellis's group. It's been really good for me and Andrea and Serafina, I think, to find a close-knit community where we're learning more and more about each other from week to week, and it's been refreshing to spend that time in a much more intimate setting than a typical Sunday morning might find us. So I hope that all of you are experiencing similar things, that God is teaching you and growing you in different ways, stretching you. And I'm really excited to bring to you right now the fourth installment of our series, If Life Has Taught Me Anything. This is, there's been three already. We started off with Derek talking about relationships and that they're worth fighting for. And then Amy talked about fruitfulness and growth. And then Kenny talked this past week about how things change. If life has taught him anything, it's that life is constantly changing. So this has obviously just been a collection of thoughts from each of us about just something that in our own personal experience in life and in our journey with Jesus, we have learned, and something that we're passionate about that we wanted to share with you guys over these few weeks. So I've been tasked with coming up with my own thesis, mantra, whatever you want to call it. And for me, the idea that I kept coming back to was this: that if life has taught me anything, it's that the cross matters, always. And that might seem super rudimentary, that might seem extremely or glaringly obvious, but I think that part of our reality is that the cross is so obvious that perhaps it's overlooked. The cross is a symbol of Jesus' sacrifice and his victory and our salvation. It's something we tend to view as something awful that happened to Jesus, which resulted in our benefit. A lot of times we say something to the effect of Christianity can be differentiated from other religions because it's not about what we do, but what somebody has done for us. And what we mean by that is we're talking about Jesus' death on the cross as a sacrifice. And it's not that we earn our way into God's grace, but rather it's something that Jesus did on our behalf. And this is not to say that that is not true. That is, the bedrock, cornerstone, foundation of our faith, and I'm certainly not trying to downplay what Jesus' death on the cross accomplished, but what I want to talk about, I keep wanting to say today or tonight. I'm recording this at 8:30 in the evening. Some of you might watch it in the morning, but whatever. Over the next few minutes, what I'd like to talk about is that the cross should be all-encompassing, not something that we just think about as something that has happened, but something that plays an integral part in our daily lives. And if all the cross is to us is something that Jesus accomplished and nothing to do with ourselves, then we miss a huge element of how the Bible speaks about the cross. And we also, I think, eliminate the thing or the truth that gives us the power to live daily transformed lives by the grace of God. So I'm going to talk about really three different areas in which the cross matters. And the first is I'm going to start with the obvious one, and that is, the cross reconciles us to God and to one another. And this is the one that we all agree on, the one we probably all most commonly think about when we think about Jesus dying on the cross. And I want to look at Ephesians 2, verses 15 and 16 to kind of sum up I think it gives a great little summary of what Jesus accomplished on the cross. And Paul writes, in this chapter, he's talking about how we as a people, or the Christians in Ephesus particularly, they were dead in their sins and had no hope. And then God, in his richness and his mercy, saved them through the grace of Jesus. And that's kind of the first 10 verses of the passage. And then he goes on to say that you were separated from one another. That some of you were under this covenant of God, and some of you were completely separated from that, and again, without hope in the world. But then he says in verses, I'm going to kind of summarize a verse and a half here in 15 and 16. He says that Jesus creates in himself one new man in place of the two. Speaking about Jews and Gentiles, or people who are different from each other, so making peace, and that he might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. So what Paul is summarizing essentially in this verse is there is an enemy and there is a hostility that has ruined our relationships. It's ruined our relationships with God, and it has ruined our relationships with one another. And when Jesus died on the cross, that not only did he die, but that hostility died with him. And so whatever barrier there was that existed between us and God and between us and one another died with Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus comes back to life, but that hostility has still been buried. So now there is opportunity for us to have uninhibited access to God, uninhibited access to one another. And here, again, he was talking about how there was one group that was under a covenant with God and one group that wasn't. And then when Jesus died, it basically abolished all of the things that we used to categorize those differences between us. And so now, no matter how different we are, what background we had, or what set of rules we followed before we knew him, the cross is the common thing for everyone. So there's now no hostility between you and me, no matter what our background is, because of the cross and the work Jesus did on it. And what reconciles us to God is the same thing that reconciles us to one another. So this is just in 2 verses, a summary of what the Gospels and all of the New Testament tell us, which is the summing up of the whole Old Testament, which is that there is an issue that we are separate from God, and that life separate from God is death. And death in the world reigns, and the whole Bible, working towards Jesus, is trying to figure out the solution to that problem. Jesus shows up, he offers himself as a sacrifice, and that sacrifice is the thing that eliminates that death. It kills the hostility. That's basically, Paul says that death dies when Jesus dies on the cross. And as a result of that, now that thing that was living between God and us is gone. And since he didn't just do that for one certain population, he didn't just do that for Jewish people, he did it for every set of people. And so not only are we now reconciled to God, but we're reconciled to one another. There's no set of laws or rules that separates us from each other because of Jesus' work on the cross. And I think this is generally well accepted by everyone. Typically, when we think about the cross this way, we're talking about it in a salvific sense, or in other words, this is what we talk about our salvation, and we focus on the fact that this work was done by Jesus and not by us. I did not do anything to earn God's favor, and I can't really do anything to resolve the issues that exist between people. Only Jesus and God can make those issues go away, and Jesus did that. And so when we think about this obviously it has profound ramifications for our eternal future, our life here, and our life amongst our neighbors. But we tend to view this with a sense of gratitude. It doesn't so much... It might change my perspective on people, but typically this is really about something I'm receiving or something I'm getting out of the cross, which is it was something terrible that happened to Jesus, but has resulted in my benefit. I'm now capable of having a good relationship with my neighbors. I'm now capable of having a uninhibited relationship with God the Father. But when the Bible talks about the cross, aside from this passage, there are lots of places where the cross is not simply something we're grateful for and something Jesus did, but it's our example of how to live life amongst one another. And so I want to talk about real quickly what Jesus has to say about the cross. I think typically when we think about Jesus and the cross, we think of him predicting his own death, where he tells his disciples a few times, that he's going to Jerusalem, he's going to be handed over and killed, and that 3 days later he's going to rise again, and they didn't believe him. And that's kind of where that story goes. We also sometimes think of John 3:16, where he says, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life, where he talks about essentially that sacrifice that's going to occur, but he doesn't explicitly talk about the cross in those passages. In fact, the only time Jesus actually uses the word cross, or at least that the disciples who wrote the four Gospels record Jesus using the word cross, are two separate instances in which he's talking to his disciples, and he tells them, if anyone wants to follow me, they need to pick up their cross daily and come after. If you want to be my disciple, pick up your cross daily and come after me. The cross and this is before he has died, so they wouldn't necessarily be associating this in a term of sacrifice, but simply thinking about what they knew, which was Romans executing Jewish people on crosses. And Jesus, in a similar vein a little bit later, says essentially the same thing. Whoever is not willing to pick up their cross and come after me is not worthy to be called my disciple. So when Jesus talks about the cross, he doesn't talk about it in the sense of the thing he is about to do, but he talks about the requirements of being one of his followers. And that is one of a person who is willing to essentially die to themselves. In the context of these mentions, he's talking about leaving the things that you have, forsaking family, not stopping to bury the dead or to reckon your financial accounts, but really to leave everything you have in order to follow him. Because what the cross is an example of is the giving up of everything you've got, right? Once you've reached, if this is just an execution, you're essentially going to your death. And that's how Jesus describes following him to a certain extent. And in one sense, there's a very literal component to that. All of his closest disciples, who we call his apostles, ended up dying for him, not necessarily crucified, but they gave up their lives for him. But in another sense, in which he uses it in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's talking about giving up the things that we might consider precious or hold on to and considering them secondary to what following him might cost. And so for Jesus, the cross is a call to sacrifice things that aren't even necessarily bad. We're not talking about giving up bad habits here. We're talking about how we prioritize things. The cross is a call for us to prioritize following Jesus above our own lives and the things that we might consider sacred, if they're not in line with what he's calling us to do. Where I'd really like to camp, though, is on what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. Because I think Paul uses this to me is the most clear example of how Paul views the cross and what it means for us as an application for our faith. So in Philippians chapter 2, Paul is talking to this group of believers in this church about the way they are to treat one another. And he says this, do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. That's Philippians 2, 3 and 4. And so in this passage, he's simply talking about what is a frequently quoted Christian virtue, which is that we are to place the needs of other people above our own. And I think that a lot of times we just think of that as being a good person when you, in a moment, you set aside what is important to you in order to meet the need of somebody else, giving up of your time, giving up of your resources, giving up of just what you want at that moment and doing something for someone else. Paul here isn't simply talking about, though, a singular instance where you might come to a moment where this happens, like, the Good Samaritan, where you find someone on the side of the road, but he's taught and, meet their needs. So that story, that's the parable Jesus tells, picking the person up, taking them to an inn, and making sure that they're provided and taken care of at your own expense. It's an example of doing that, but he's not talking about, when you come to a crisis moment. He's talking about a lifestyle, which is a rather impossible way to live. Frankly speaking, we don't do a very good job of setting aside ourselves for others. And yet, this is what Paul seems to think is an essential part of living life in Christian community, that we are going to count others more significant than ourselves. It's not only doing something for somebody else, but it is thinking that that person's needs are more important than my own needs. And that's a mindset that will affect a lifestyle, not just a singular act, if that makes sense. And the reason I know that is because of what he says in the following few verses here. Starting in 2:5, immediately following that, he says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so what Paul says here is, in order for us to, or he basically says, if you're going to live this way, if you're asking the question, how in the world am I to live a life where I consider other people more important than myself? I mean, that's an easy thing to say, but to really think about it and consider other people more important than my own needs is not something I think that comes naturally to anyone and is very difficult to do on a consistent basis. And so Paul says, if you're thinking that, what you need to do is have the mind that is yours in Christ Jesus. Essentially, have the same mind that Jesus had. And then his example is what Jesus did by going to his death on the cross. And so the mind of Christ, when it comes to placing other people's needs above our own, is the example of Jesus when he decided to give up his own rights and privileges as God himself and empty himself of those things in order to place our needs above his personal needs. Because obviously being crucified, being humiliated, having your name defamed, having the people you love betray you, all of those things are not having your own needs met. He laid aside what his needs were in order to meet our needs. And specifically here, what Paul says is that even though Jesus is equal with God, is in the form of God, or is God himself essentially, he didn't consider that something to be grasped, is the word, which literally means, it's like a picture of of grabbing like a lever, like something that helps to your advantage. So like essentially, pulling on a lever is a way for you to maximize your advantages in order to get what you need. And though Jesus essentially could have pulled the lever to take advantage of being God and never had to be crucified, he lets go of that privilege. He gives up his own rights. And this is something that is very counter to us Christians, especially in the West, when we think about how much conversation we spend talking about our rights and what we have a right to do. Jesus essentially relinquishes all of that, and Paul says empties himself so that he can go to his own death. So not only does he give up the things that he could be doing, but at the same time, it results in him being killed. If you think about the passage where Pilate asks Jesus if he's a king, and Jesus says, if I was a king in this world, I would have my armies come and rescue me. He says that his angels could come and fight on his behalf. But that is not the way of Jesus' kingdom. And what Jesus does over the course of the last week of his life is completely counterintuitive to the way we would triumph or we would win. Paul goes on to say that in Philippians chapter 2, that therefore, as a result of this, God highly exalts Jesus and gives him a name above every name. And what Jesus does is basically give up everything that you would assume would make him a champion. He has an opportunity because of his profound wisdom, because of his ability to do the miraculous, because of all of the godlike qualities that are a part of him, where he can move things and shape things so that he comes out the conquering hero that week in Jerusalem. But instead, he antagonizes the religious, he antagonizes the wealthy, pretty much any group of people that are in power. Jesus makes himself their enemy through his actions and through his words, so that by the end of the week, everyone who could possibly save him from his demise, he has turned against him. And I don't say that to say that Jesus is just suicidal, but rather what he's saying is, I'm not going to get on good terms with the world in order to save myself or in order to win over the world. But I'm going to go about winning the way that people in my kingdom will win. And to him, that means giving up all of those advantages that he might have. Any of the people who would come after him or follow him who have influence or the ability to make him king right there in Jerusalem, he says basically that he wants no part of doing it the way they would do it. Because the way the kingdom of God is won, the way the kingdom of heaven is brought about, is through emptying ourselves of our rights and our advantages and giving of ourselves even to the point of sacrificial death. And as a result of that, God exalts Jesus above every other name. And again, I can't stress how completely opposite to the world we live in this is. And why it's so important for us to embrace this aspect of the cross in our communities. When we spend our time trying to leverage political advantages, or when we get really excited about the fact that someone who is really influential or famous or has a level of celebrity speaks the name of Jesus because we think of all the good things they can do, we're playing by the world's rules, which is that we need to grab a hold of anything that could give us influence or power and leverage that to our advantage to bring about good things for Jesus. When in fact, Jesus says the exact opposite, which is we speak truth to power, we speak truth to influencers, and we don't sacrifice any of those things in order to gain positions of prestige or influence ourselves. Because to do that just means we've become just like the rest of the world rather than becoming like Jesus. And we allow God to determine how the victory is going to win when we're willing to be critical of power, when we're willing to give up our own advantages in order to place the needs of other people above ourselves, we let God determine the outcome. We let God be the one who exalts us into a position next to Jesus. And so we have to learn to embrace this cross-like lifestyle, which says, I'm going to give up the things that I think are important, or the ways I see people winning in the world. I let go of those things in order to follow in Jesus' example, or to have the mind of Jesus. The last area that I want to talk about with the cross is specifically how when we do both of these first two things, when we embrace the fact that the cross has reconciled us to God and to Jesus and one another, when we embrace the fact that having the mind of Jesus means living a lifestyle where we place other people's needs above our own, and that's done by following Jesus even to death if necessary, then the cross is what helps us endure when life throws extremely difficult things at us. I'm thinking specifically of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where Paul is talking about difficult circumstances in his life. And he tells the Christians in Corinth, he says, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. We are always carrying in our bodies the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies." What Paul is essentially saying here is that life has been difficult for him as a result of being a follower of Jesus, but the circumstances of life have not caused his attitude in life to be changed. So he says, essentially, we're afflicted, but we're not crushed. While my physical circumstances might be that I am hurt or I am in pain, I'm not letting that crush me. I'm perplexed. Life is confusing and stressful, but I'm not driven to despair about it. I'm persecuted, but I know I haven't been forsaken. And I'm struck down, but that doesn't mean that I've been destroyed. Each of these is just really a different synonym for saying I'm getting beaten up by life. But because Paul has seen the example of Jesus on the cross, and because he knows that part of living life following Jesus is giving up on my own priorities and following after Jesus, that means that those difficult things are just an example of meaning that I'm doing it right. It means that the things that happened to Jesus now are happening to me in this world. And so, our suffering then has meaning, or it has purpose. And we can even find this now in things that aren't directly persecution, but just the difficulties of life. If I have lived my life giving up of my own needs and coming to grips with the fact that it's the death of myself that really results in the kingdom, then when hard things and difficult things come into my life, I'm prepared for it. Because I know that ultimately, just like Jesus' suffering produced new life, my suffering will do the same. That's what Paul says in verse 10. He says that we carry in our bodies the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested within them. Just like Jesus dies on the cross and then he's raised, God highly exalts him and he's raised from the dead, our suffering, just like Jesus's, will produce new life. And so we find purpose in our suffering, knowing what happened with Jesus when he suffered. We can cling to that hope in our own lives when suffering comes our way. And the last passage I want to talk about in that same vein is Hebrews chapter 12. This is a very famous verse. And we typically think about it in just like our life journey, or this is a very popular like life verse for people. And they think about it as far as like the whole of their experience. But Paul specifically here is immediately talking about people who live their life in faith following Jesus, and things didn't always go well for them, and they couldn't see the finish line. And a lot of them were persecuted. He says, that some were. I'm trying to find. Some suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment, stoned, sawn in two, killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And so he's coming. It's immediately after this passage where he's talking about all these people who lived lives of great faith, where he says this. In verse 12, he says, in chapter 12, I'm sorry. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So Jesus, again, the example here is Jesus on the cross for the way we are supposed to live. It's not simply a look back on what Jesus has done and a thankfulness for that. Again, that's part of it. That gives us perspective, but the example for the way we're to live our lives is Jesus going to the cross. And Paul says that because of the joy set before him, because he knew what was on the other side of it, Jesus despised the shame that came with the cross and pressed on and went and died and endured the cross. And so when suffering comes our way or when hardships are involved in our life, Paul says that we are to receive them the way Jesus received them, which was, if you remember, Jesus didn't pray he did pray in the garden for a way out. He said, if it's possible for this not to happen, for this, what the next 24 hours are going to bring, where he's, again, betrayed and then beaten and accused of awful things and then murdered, Jesus says, if there's another way to do this, let it be, but ultimately not my will but yours. And in that moment, Jesus sets aside what he would prefer for what needs to be done, and he endures the shame of the cross. Again, a humiliating death, stripped and on display for everyone to see you in your weakest moment, the moment of your death. It's an awful thing that you would never wish on anyone. Jesus endures that because of the joy set before him, because he knows what that is going to result in for us. Because he knows that in that moment he's setting aside his own needs so that our needs can be met. And as a result of that, God raises him up. And so this is our example for when life is difficult and hard. We think about what Jesus endured to make the world a better place. And that's the example for us, that when hardship and difficult things come along, we can pray to God, please find a way out of this. But ultimately, not our will, but yours, Lord. And if what it means is for us to endure shame, if what it means is for us to be afflicted, if what it means is that we're going to be humiliated, that doesn't mean that God is not going to achieve his victory. And so the cross matters. It matters because of our relationship with God and what that is now. It matters in our relationships with one another. And it matters when we try to live a life like Jesus. It has to be a part of our calculation when we're sitting there day by day with people around us who get on our nerves, with family members who might drive us crazy, when we're enduring the difficulties of living life in a pandemic, and when people around us are very polarized by a national election. The cross matters because that lens should affect the way we treat one another. We have to see, every time that I have an interaction, I need to be asking myself, how do I make sure that this person's needs, that I'm looking at them as their needs greater than my own? So that's what life has taught me in following Jesus. This is already way too long. I appreciate you for listening, for sticking with it. I hope this is as meaningful for you as it's been in my own life. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again soon, as soon as possible. Grace and peace be with you. I love you all.